Dennis Rader, later known as the BTK Killer, was born on March 9, 1945 to parents Dorothea and William Rader. Growing up in Kansas, Dennis was the oldest of 4 children and was heavily involved in church as well as Cub Scouts. At one point, he even saved the life of a fellow scout. On a camping trip around 1960, the river had swelled. Dennis, with a younger boy in his canoe, paddled as hard as he could against the current, saving himself and his friend. He was later regarded as a hero. Despite this, Dennis would develop strange sexual fantasies. Even while in grade school, he would think about torture. Along with this, he would strangle and hang cats and dogs. Around puberty, his fantasies escalated and started including tying girls up and S.A.ing them. After graduating high school, he would join the Air Force. It was here that he would become a peeping Tom, spying on women who were changing and stealing their underwear. Later on, after the Air Force, he would get a job at an aircraft manufacturer to which he would eventually be let go from. With his new free time, he once again divulged into his bizarre sexual fantasies, becoming obsessed with the idea of strangling a woman to death. Along with this, he would stalk women in public, daydreaming about kidnapping and murdering them. In 1974, these urges would overpower him, and he would act them out on a family who had recently moved into his neighborhood. The Otero family. On January 15, 1974, at approximately 8:20 a.m., Dennis Rader jumped over a white fence leading to the backyard of the Otero family residence. Immediately following this, he cut their telephone line which ran on the side of the house. Suddenly, the Otero family dog left the house, startling Dennis and causing him to drop his knife. Dennis quickly entered the home, shut the door behind him, and pulled out his gun. It was there that he ran into Julie and her 11-year-old daughter Josie, who were making peanut butter sandwiches. The father, Joe Otero, sat at the kitchen table. This surprised Dennis as he hadn't planned on the 38-year-old aircraft mechanic being there. Regardless, he claimed that he was a wanted man and needed money, food, and a car, promising they wouldn't get hurt if they complied. Joe Otero initially thought it was a prank, asking if his brother-in-law put him up to the task. At this point, Dennis showed his gun, forcing all 4 members of the family into the living room. He then pulled out the cords from his hit kit and tied their hands and ankles together. All 4 of them complained that he tied the cords too tightly, that their circulation was being cut off. Dennis paid them no mind. Instead, he dragged them all one by one to the master bedroom. Soon, he brought in a plastic bag. The Otero family, seeing this, immediately began to struggle. Unfortunately, the cords binding them made this struggle useless. Dennis walked up to Joe Otero, slipping the plastic bag over his head. He then sealed the base of it with another cord, wrapping it tightly around Joe's neck, cutting off the circulation. Dennis made his way to Julie with another cord and wrapped it around her throat. She soon lost consciousness. When Dennis turned, he found that Joe was still alive, chewing a hole through the plastic bag. From here, he retrieved a shirt from the bedroom and used a belt to tie it over the plastic. Blood rushed to Joe's face. The plastic bag sticking to his skin, he was left gasping for a breath of air that would never come. After a few moments, he stopped struggling. Dennis then turned to Josie, the little girl who was now crying for her mother. Ignoring her cries, Dennis Rader strangled her. He then put a bag over 9-year-old Joey's head, leaving the boy to suffocate. At this time, Julie regained consciousness, instantly crying when she noticed both her children were dead. Dennis gagged, then put a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing. He then looked around the room, noticing Joey still wasn't dead. The young child was dragged by Dennis to another bedroom. It was here that Dennis placed Joey on the bed before putting a pillowcase over his head. Dennis Rader then sat in a chair, watching the child shudder, fall off the bed, and suffocate on the floor. Going back into the master bedroom, Dennis found again that young Josie still wasn't dead. After he brought her to the basement, she asked what was going to happen to her. And to that, Dennis responded, "Well, honey, you're going to be in heaven tonight with the rest of your family." After that statement, he would tie a rope around the girl's neck, hanging her from a sewer pipe on the ceiling. From here, Dennis would take pictures of the dead bodies, take a few mementos, and drive off. Down the road, he would discover he had left his knife in the family's backyard. Knowing his fingerprints were on it, he returned to the house to retrieve it. Later that day, he would drive to a wooded area and burn all the evidence. Catherine Bright. Around 4 months later, Dennis took some time off from studying criminal justice at Wichita State University. It was here that he spotted 21-year-old Catherine Bright and began planning another attack. On April 4th, 1974, he made his way to her house. However, once he knocked on the door, he found that no one was home. He made his way around the back, punched a hole through the window, and let himself inside. Realizing the glass would tip her off, he swept it up and then went through her personal stuff. While he waited for her, Dennis would accidentally fire his gun in the house. After this, he would hide in a closet. At approximately 12:30 p.m., he would hear the front door open. Immediately, he would rush to the living room with his gun pulled out. Things again did not go according to plan. Catherine had arrived home with her younger brother Kevin. Regardless, Dennis aimed his gun at them, telling them he was wanted in California and needed food, money, and a car. He then directed them to the bedroom, ordering Kevin to tie Catherine's hands behind her back. Afterwards, he tied Kevin to the bed, took Catherine to another bedroom, and turned on the stereo to drown out the noise. Before this, he decided he was going to finish off Kevin first. Unfortunately for Dennis, Kevin was soon able to free himself and the two men fought. During the struggle, Dennis would shoot the 19-year-old in the forehead. He eventually went back to Catherine, explaining that Kevin had been wounded but would be just fine. Not believing what she had been told, Catherine struggled to get free. Dennis, knowing she wouldn't be able to, went back to check on Kevin. To the surprise of Dennis, Kevin hadn't died. In fact, he was up on his feet and was now wrestling with him. Soon, Kevin was gaining the upper hand, grabbing at the .357 Magnum that Dennis had on his hip. At this point, Dennis pulled out his .22 caliber pistol, shooting Kevin in the face. Kevin went down, blood pouring from his wound. Finally, he went back to Catherine and attempted to strangle her. During this time, she fought back and eventually was able to break free. He hit her again and again. However, so did she. Right then and there, Dennis heard a sound that most likely sent a chill down his spine. That sound was the side door slamming shut. Kevin still wasn't dead. He'd escaped and was running down the street looking for help. The clock was now ticking, meaning that none of his twisted fantasies would be able to be fulfilled. And with that, he pulled out two knives, continuously slashing and stabbing Catherine. Blood splattered on the floor as well as on his shoes and pants. Paying no mind to this, he fled through the back door, attempting to steal Catherine's car. This car would not start. In a panic, he rushed into a nearby pickup truck. Dennis wasn't able to start this vehicle either. With time running out, he dashed out of the truck and ran up the street, eventually getting in his own vehicle. He'd drive back home, clean himself up, and then hide all the evidence in the basement of his parents' house. Later that night, he would greet his wife, pretending as if his day was just a normal day. During this time, Kevin had found 2 people who drove him to the hospital. Along with this, the owners of a nearby business called the police. In a pure stroke of luck for Dennis, the police went to the business first, rather than to the residents of the attack. Catherine would later be found barely alive in a large pool of blood. With her hand grasping a telephone, she had 3 knife wounds to her stomach. Her skin was also becoming blue, indicating that one or both of her lungs had collapsed. Once she had been taken to the hospital, it was discovered that not only her larynx had been broken, but she had been stabbed 11 times. Catherine Bright would later die during surgery. Kevin would survive after a 2-week stay in the hospital. Shirley Relford. Sometime after murdering Catherine, Dennis would go to a club named the Blackout Tavern. It was there that he met a woman named Cheryl. After having small talk with her, he followed her home that night and found out that she had a 6-year-old child. On March 17, 1977, he went to her house but found that she wasn't home. He continued down the street before meeting a 6-year-old boy named Steve Relford. Dennis made his way to Steve, showing him a photograph of a woman and a child. In reality, the picture was of Paula and Carrie, Dennis Rader's own wife and daughter. Dennis would ask Steve if he had seen either of the people in the picture. After the boy said no, both went on their way, Steve walking back to his house with a soup and money order his mother had sent him to get. After giving his mother both items, he sat down and watched TV with his siblings. Only a few minutes later, Dennis knocked on the door, claimed he was a detective, and pulled out a gun. He then told her kids that he was going to tie up their mother and take pictures of her. Around this time, Shirley walked into the room. Not before long, Dennis was binding her hands behind her back. He then began to do the same to her children, but didn't want to bother with their crying and fighting. Instead, he locked them in the bathroom. When the 6-year-old yelled out that he was going to escape, Dennis responded that if he did, he would get his head blown off. After this, Dennis Rader tied Shirley to a bed frame. Soon, he had removed her bathrobe and was looping a cord around her neck, strangling her. Unfortunately for the kids, they had gotten the bathroom door open just enough to be able to witness this. They soon began screaming and banging on the door. Dennis stopped mid-murder, grabbed some toys, and then threw them in the bathroom to distract them. Obviously, this didn't work. Regardless, Dennis went back to Shirley, continuing to strangle the life from her body. A few moments later, he slipped a plastic bag over her head and then covered the plastic with her nightrobe. As the mother of 3 suffocated, Dennis pleasured himself as he watched her body fight for life. During this time, the phone would ring. Dennis still had plans to strangle the 2 boys and hang the young girl. However, he feared that someone would check on the house if the phone was left unanswered. With that, he grabbed 2 pairs of panties and fled the house. Shirley's dead body was left tied to the bed with the plastic still covering her face. Nancy Fox. Around the end of 1997, Dennis had been stalking a woman named Nancy Fox, learning every detail of her life that he could. He had went through her mailbox, followed her while she went shopping, knew what church she went to, and had even broken into her house to steal her underwear. And during all of this, Nancy was none the wiser. On the evening of December 8th, 1977, Dennis told his wife that he was going to study at the library. Instead, he drove to Nancy's house, knowing she wouldn't be home at that time. Just to make sure, he still knocked on the front door. After there was no answer, he made his way to the back of the house, cutting the telephone wire. From here, he broke in through a window and hid in her bedroom. An hour later, the front door opened. Nancy entered the house, soon making her way to the bedroom. The second she stepped in the room, Dennis aimed his gun at her. Nancy then told him she needed a smoke, made her way to the living room table, and then lit up a cigarette. After a brief exchange, she exclaimed that she wanted to get it done and over with. To her surprise, Dennis took out ropes and handcuffs, telling her to lie face down on her bed. After taking his own clothes off, he bound her. A few moments later, he removed her underwear and then wrapped a belt around her neck until she lost consciousness. Once she did, he freed up the belt, allowing her to regain her senses. He then whispered in her ear, letting her know that not only was he the serial killer, but that she was going to die. Nancy, realizing that she was going to lose her life, fought back, grabbing him by his genitals. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to stop him. Dennis squeezed tighter on the belt, doing so this time until her body stopped moving. With her face beet red, blood dripped from her mouth. During the strangulation, she had bitten through her lips. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Dennis climbed out the back window, walked back to his car, and went home. The next morning on December 9th, 1977, he went to a payphone and reported the murder. After this day, he wouldn't strike again for another 8 years. Maureen Hedge. It wasn't until 1985 that the urge to kill would overcome Dennis Rader. This time, it was a 53-year-old woman named Maureen Hedge who lived just a few doors down. Soon he stalked her, forming a plan for her murder. On April 26 of that year, he wore his Cubmaster uniform, using his son's Cub Scouts as an alibi. While the young boys ate hot dogs around a campfire, Dennis told the group that he needed to get some rest. When he was sure that no one was watching, he got into his car and drove off. Later on down the road, he would change into dark clothing before parking his car and going inside a bowling alley. Dennis would then order a beer, splash some on his clothing and face, and then call a taxi. Once the taxi arrived, he pretended to be drunk, having the driver drop him off near his home. A few moments later, he cut through a park before going into the backyard of Maureen Hedge. Dennis Rader would then cut the telephone wire, break into her home, and wait for her. To his surprise, she came home with a man. Not wanting another confrontation, he waited until the man left. This wouldn't be until 1 in the morning. Still, Dennis waited until he was sure that Maureen was asleep and got into bed with her. Before she even had a chance to react, he climbed on top of her and wrapped his hands around her throat, choking her. Soon she passed out. Dennis took the opportunity to cuff her hands behind her back. At this point, he wrapped his belt around her neck, pulling with all his might until she was dead. As usual, he would then go through her house, looking for trophies. He would take her driver's license and car keys. Eventually, he would drag her body out of the house and put her in the trunk of her own car. At around 2 a.m., he would drive off, heading to his church. Being a church leader and a trusted member of his community, he had keys to the building. He dragged her dead body into the church and down to the basement. Over the next 3 hours, Dennis would take 30 Polaroid pictures of Maureen's body in various positions. When morning finally came, he cleaned up the evidence. Soon he dragged the body back to the car and dumped it in a culvert on the other side of town. Later on, he would drive back to the bowling alley, get into his own car, and drive back to the Cub Scout event. No one had noticed he'd been gone. Vicki Wegerly. 4 months later, in August of 1986, Dennis spotted 28-year-old Vicki Wegerly exiting her car. During the next 3 weeks, he would stalk her, finding out everything he could about her as usual. Fast forward to September 16th, 1986, Dennis drove to a shopping mall. After parking his car, he walked across the street and eventually knocked on his victim's door. Vicki, who was playing the piano, answered. Dennis then explained that he was from a repair company and needed to check the telephone line. Once she let him inside, he pretended to check the wire before pulling out his gun and pointing it at her. He took her to the bedroom, bound her hands and ankles, and then shoved her onto the bed. At this point, Dennis removed a cord from his briefcase. Vicki, realizing he was going to kill her, prayed to God. Dennis wrapped the cord around her throat and pulled, but it broke. Vicki took this opportunity to free her hands and fought back, eventually falling off the bed with Dennis. She clawed at his face and neck, leaving blood dripping down his flesh. Dennis struck her in the head with his fist. While she was stunned, he grabbed a pair of stockings, wrapped them around her throat, and continued to strangle her. It only took a few minutes until Vicki was dead. From here, he tied the stockings around her face, covering her mouth. Then, he removed her clothing before getting his camera from his briefcase. Dennis Rader spent the next few minutes taking pictures of Vicki's corpse. After he was satisfied, he made his exit, passing Vicki's crying 2-year-old son in the living room. Outside, he got into her car and drove off, coincidentally passing Vicki's husband Bill, who was driving back home. Dennis would stop at a convenience store before throwing his briefcase into a dumpster. He then would continue on, dropping off more of the evidence at various locations. Eventually, he would make his way back to his own car and go home. Dolores Davis. In 1988, Dennis would lose his job at the burglar alarm company, which would lead him to get a new job. While working one day, he came across a woman who he again began to stalk for weeks. Eventually, he would break into her house and wait for her to arrive home. Luckily for her, she did not, and Dennis left the house. Following this, he would not kill again until 1991, 5 years after Vicki. That is until he spotted 62-year-old Dolores Davis, or D as she was known to her friends. On January 18th of that year, he would join another camping trip with his son's Cub Scout group. Later that night, he would travel to his parents' house, change into dark clothing, and then drive to his church where he would retrieve his hit kit. At around 10 p.m., he would walk to Dee's house, soon clipping the telephone wire. After this, he waited in her backyard until he was sure she was asleep. Around midnight, he threw a brick through her sliding glass door and entered her house. Dee exited the bedroom confused, asking Dennis if he had crashed into her house with his car. Dennis told her that he had not, and then used his ruse of being a wanted man who needed food and a car. He then cuffed her hands behind her back and tied pantyhose around her ankles. After some time, Dennis would find another pair of pantyhose, strangling her with them. He would then take her jewelry box, camera, and driver's license before dragging her body to the trunk of his car. Following this, Dennis would drive to a man-made lake, hiding her body under some bushes. Next, he would hide his trophies in his church and then drive back to Dee's house to pick up his own car. Finally, he would drive back to his victim's body, picking her back up. His plan was to drive to a deserted barn and take pictures of her dead body. However, he was running out of time at this point. He needed to get back to his son's Cub Scout camp before anyone noticed he was gone. And with that, he drove to a nearby bridge. From here, he dragged the dead body out of the trunk, letting it hit the pavement. Then he dragged the corpse under a bridge, leaving it in a pile of debris. Soon he drove back to camp, arriving once again without anyone knowing he was gone. The next night, he would go back to her body, finding that animals had already started to eat part of her flesh. Disregarding this, he put a mask over her face and then took several pictures of her. He would leave the mask with her and then go home. 12 days later, Dee's decayed body would be found by a young boy walking his dog. The arrest of Dennis Rader. After 1991, the urge to kill simply wasn't there anymore. However, he would still do strange things such as taking pictures of himself tied up while pretending to be his victims. At one point, he dug a grave for himself, climbed inside, and again took his own picture. At one of his son's Cub Scout events, he would tie himself up in the back of his truck while pleasuring himself. Once he was done, he realized he was stuck and feared he would be found by one of the boys at camp. He eventually was able to get himself loose. In the years following this, he would grow silent, leaving the world to wonder if BTK was ever a serial killer to begin with. Over a decade later in 2004, a lawyer by the name of Robert Beatty would write a book regarding the murders. Eventually, this would lead Dennis to begin communicating with police about his crimes. After many months of back and forth exchanges, he would ask the police if he could communicate via floppy disk without being traced. If the answer was no, he told them to put a classified ad in the newspaper saying, "Rex, it will be okay," which they did. This would be his downfall. Later on, he would send the police a floppy disk with a file named Test. Police would then analyze the properties of the file, seeing that it was created by a man named Dennis. They would also find the computer used to make the file belonged to Christ Lutheran Church. It only took a simple Google search of the church to find that the name of the congregational president was a man named Dennis Rader. On February 25th, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over by a group of police officers. His DNA would eventually be matched to the DNA found at the scene of the murders. He himself would admit during the interrogation that he was BTK, later stating that he was disappointed that the police had lied to him. Dennis Rader, the BTK Strangler, would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of today, at age 77, he resides at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas.